Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Petra Wolfbeis. I'm the Director of Membership with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. I know folks are still joining us, so I think we'll wait a few more seconds and then we'll get going. So as mentioned, I'm Petra Wolfbeis. I'm the Director of Membership with AMO. Good afternoon, and on behalf of AMO and the Rural Ontario Municipal Association, also known as ROMA, thank you for joining us today. As I'm assuming most of you joining us understand that broadband and connectivity is a key advocacy issue for ROMA and AMO, an issue that is complex and complicated for many municipalities to navigate. Several months ago, ROMA contracted with AMO policy staff to develop resources to support municipal elected officials and their staff in the considerations and discussions that you undertake into local decision making on this issue. So over several months, Amber Crawford, I'm pleased to introduce both Amber Crawford today, who's AMO policy advisor, as well as Craig Reed, AMO senior advisor. They developed these great resources, and as you know, they were released last week. They are here today to walk you through them and answer your questions. So Craig and Amber, thank you very much for your hard work and great work going into this, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So with that, I wanted to give everyone a bit of an overview of what we're going to do today and what we're trying to do. But before I do that, I think there's some logistics that Amber wanted to go over. So I will turn it to Amber. And we can't hear you, Amber.
Okay, can you do that now? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. So thanks, Craig. So thank you all for joining. I've already found the mute button, but actually everyone is muted due to the number of registrants that we have today. And so there's two ways to participate through the Zoom function. One is through the chat window. You can chat ideally through for technical issues if you can't hear or see or you sort of lose the feed. But you could also chat privately to panelists being Craig and myself today. And as well as Brittany, who is our fantastic tech on the call today. The question and answer window is really where we're going to ask people to participate today, and that sort of allows us to sort of answer things as they come in sequence, and we'll be answering those live. The slides today is going to be circulated to all of the participants that are on today's call, and the presentation is being recorded and will be posted as well. So if there's people that either join late or there are colleagues of yours that weren't able to join, feel free to send them the link when it's posted. And what we've done today is sort of broken it up into sections. Over the lunch hour, which I hope you have your lunch in front of you, we're going to sort of take different breaks. We're going to take probably a 5-minute bio break, maybe around 1 if it makes sense. But if there are questions that we do not get to, we are going to follow up directly with folks as well. So this is very much the beginning of a conversation with Craig and I. But with that, I'm going to pass it back to Craig to take us through some of the context of why we're here today.
Thanks, Amber. So today, as Petra mentioned, we're here to take you through some resources that we've put together for ROMA. They're available on ROMA's website, and I assume that you've all had the chance to go through them a little bit, or at least download them. The first resource is a connectivity primer, or 101, and the second resource is a roadmap 101. And then we will also cover some of the programs that the federal and provincial governments have put together to try and improve connectivity solutions for Canada and Ontario, respectively. We may not get to an entire discussion on those, depending on how this goes, but there are links in the presentation for you to get more information if you need them. So basically, ROMA has been seized for some time with the need for better connectivity in rural, northern, and remote areas of Ontario. And very much, I think everyone is aware in these times, but this has been building for some time, that connectivity is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity. And ROMA has been working to try and improve connectivity solutions for the communities that they represent. It's become a major policy challenge at the municipal level. And it's fair to say that demand has been growing, and people have been hearing from constituents such as seniors, businesses, students, and others that they need better connectivity to improve their prosperity and quality of life, and the ability to do things that they want to do and participate in a modern economy. So we worked with ROMA to define a bit of a role for ourselves. And I think it's fair to say what we tried to do is translate what is a very technical field, that of connectivity, into a discussion that municipal governments are able to engage with better on a policy and governance viewpoint. It's very important to realize, and I think many of you do, that municipal governments don't have a mandated role in telecom. Municipal governments do care about community outcomes, of course, and the need for economic development. But the regulatory and policy levers, for the most part, reside with the provincial and federal levels of government. That said, municipal governments have been a prime driver, and communities have been a prime driver in articulating the need for better connectivity across Ontario, and advocating for better solutions. And I think we're seeing some of the outcomes of that with federal and provincial funding, and other programs to help improve connectivity. So with that said, municipalities are part of the solution. For those of you who aren't aware, AMO and ROMA are the voice of councils to the province of Ontario, being the provincial government and the federal government. ROMA focuses on rural municipal governments and the issues that are particular to them. And AMO is the voice of elected councils. So we've got some information there about who we represent, but it's fair to say that these two associations work very closely together. And as policy staff at AMO, we support them both. So we are here to talk about the meat of this, which is two documents. As I said, we've tried to translate a very technical field of telecommunications into something that is a little more understandable. We understood from ROMA members and others that not only was this becoming a bigger issue in their communities, but they were having trouble understanding where to start with connectivity. Sometimes proposals would come in, and it was hard to assess what those proposals would do for a community. There are tons of technical terms and all sorts of engineering involved in this, and there will still continue to be a role for that. But from our point of view, we were trying to provide some consistent information on connectivity. We were trying to create a framework to evaluate the policy decisions and how municipal governments could be involved, create a better understanding of what was possible for municipal governments to do, and identify actions that councils could take to prepare for those conversations around connectivity. So if you will, what we really tried to do is build a policy lens for municipal connectivity. And it's fair to say that we reached out far and wide. And I think some of the folks that were involved with us and helped us out and increased our understanding are on this call. And we thank them all because they played a very, very big role in the documents in front of you. So hopefully those documents that Amber is going to go through momentarily will help councils senior staff, and others in municipalities and communities generally to have a better sense of where to start, how to, what they ought to do with connectivity, and what they may ought not to do. And as I said, there are 2 resources, and I'm going to bring it over to Amber to take you through them. Thanks, Amber.
Thanks, Craig. Off mute on both. So, good afternoon again. I just wanted to bring you through quickly a summary of just the 2 documents. We are going to, as I say, talk about the primer first. We'll pause for questions, and then talk about the roadmap. And as Craig alluded to, talk a bit about funding at the end with a bit of a break in between. But what I'll do is I'll start right into the primer. And what I will say is, as we go through, I'm sort of building, we decided to build a narrative around what it was. So it's not, certainly not by section, but in terms of how we would explain it to folks, this is sort of the way that we've outlined it. So as Craig said at the beginning, connectivity has really become almost as vital to a community's economic prosperity as traditional infrastructure, which is things that you are mandated to take care of, such as sort of clean drinking water, electricity, and roads. And so with connectivity steadily increasing, we have noticed that it's the COVID-19 pandemic, and most of you on this call will certainly be aware of how major a catalyst for change it's been, but it has not been the only one. In fact, it's only one of the latest. And so what we have through ROMA have done is sort of talk about certain short and long-term solutions to help bridge this digital divide. And by digital divide, it's going to be really important on this call in particular for Craig and I to define our terms. We've sort of described them by 3 different gaps, and we're going to speak to each of them in a bit. One is about the availability of broadband, service quality, and the third is affordability of services. I will say that as we go into sort of the availability of broadband, it is important to know that we do talk about cellular, and it is something that both the province and federal government have also identified as really important. But for the purpose of today, most of our discussion is going to be about broadband, but can certainly answer questions in cellular as well. As you'll see on slide 11, we talk about availability as one of the criteria that we really see through this digital divide, and it's something that the province has certainly quantified. As you'll see, 12% is what the province has estimated that does not have sufficient connectivity or connectivity at all, and 9% of roads are still not covered by the latest cellular technology in Ontario. That's of course larger at the Canadian level, and some of these charts and sources are from the CRTC's Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission's report in 2019. And so this is really in Annex A of this report, talking about the fact that the basic service objective in 2016 is the speed of 50/10 unlimited data plan. And I think a lot of folks hear it, but don't necessarily know what it means. And so what we're trying to do is define some of these terms in the paper so that if you're totally new to this, you learn a lot. And if you aren't, or in the middle of the process, you can still learn something. But as a base level of understanding, what the federal government, who does have a policy and most of the regulatory and funding decisions in telecommunications, has determined that 100% of Canadians by 2030 are to experience speeds of at least 50 megabits per second download and 10 megabits per second upload for fixed broadband services with an unlimited data option. And that, of course, we know does not exist in many rural communities. There are data caps, and we'll speak about that. But also the latest cellular technology should be available along all major Canadian roads, not only just all homes and businesses. And as you can see on the right-hand chart, this just sort of just in one slide shows just the disparity. We're not going to talk about the disparity. We're just going to say it exists. And so what are we doing to solve it? So another thing that we've talked about criteria-wise is service quality. So in our paper, we say that even if it is possible to get online, sometimes it's not sufficient or reliable for things such as latency, experiencing jitter, and packet loss. And those again are defined in this primer. But the seismic shift towards working from home e-commerce, e-learning, et cetera, all of these things have led to quality issues. And what we've noticed in the research that we did in the last sort of few months is that not only do urban communities have higher download speeds, as you'll see the Sierra chart on your left talks about those download speeds, which is really the measure upon which a lot of the not only the funding, but how you experience things on the ground is sort of measured. But urban communities do have more choices generally in terms of buying bigger packages. So I want to make sure that there's a nuance to this chart, that it does not just sort of come across as quite a disparity. I will say that 5.5 megabits per second download in July is up from the 3 point whatever that was in April. So it is increasing. However, I will say that the reason why these download speeds are quite high in urban is not only because of choices, but because there's the ability to buy bigger packages. And so that's a really important thing that we wanted to make sure was known, but can obviously answer questions in that later on in this session. In terms of affordability, this is something that is absolutely essential to solve, and our research, and certainly the federal government's research in their report, had said urban centers increased by 4% between 2016 and 2019 when you take spending per month on internet. That was more than double what, or less than half on the corollary for rural communities. They increased by 8.7 over the same time period. And so obviously affordability is affected by competition, but also these data caps that I mentioned. And so I won't read out loud the quote that we've got underneath, but basically the telecom regulatory policy in 2016, which also outlined the basic service objective, which is not a requirement, very important, is that the availability of usage monitoring tools and data coverage notifications would provide more certainty and certainly allow residents in rural communities to be more empowered to avoid bill shock, which is something that we know many of you face today. What we talk about in the next section is talking about the public and private investment that's necessary to solve this divide. And it's very important to understand the not only what we are hearing from TSPs, being the telecommunication service providers and internet service providers. Together, we call those private telecommunications companies. Those folks are, as you will probably have heard, things like there is no business case to move to your community or to connect a certain neighborhood, et cetera. And that is, of course, because they want to achieve the highest return on investment as possible for their shareholders. However, implementing public funding for connectivity infrastructure is something that certainly the province and the federal government has mentioned as a priority. And there's accountability and transparency measures built in and required to use those taxpayer dollars. And so you will also see this tension between private sector that would like to build, if they do want to build in that community, and the public taxpayer dollars that are required to build those. And so together, they really do have to work in tandem. And so the necessary solution, we say in the paper, is that both governments and industry have to work together to leverage those opportunities. And at the same time, public investment has to create conditions to allow these private companies to use their capital to serve people longer term and invest to keep services current. And this is what we talk about in the roadmap a bit later, is about the notion of future proofing and making sure that it is not just that a company comes in and provides you a service and then does not come back around to increase that service. As we know, it's a much longer conversation and need for funding longer term. So what we say in the paper is about the need to build a community business case. And I think this is a really interesting thing that that certainly ROMA picked up on, and many of its members, is the idea that the benefits that connectivity brings are much larger than what a private sector business case would include. So whereas private sector typically depends on the economics, obviously, and not all of it. I'm not to say that that other indirect benefits can come from it, but it really is a public sector that can talk about all of those sort of economic, social, and environmental benefits that come from connectivity funding. And in fact, that investing in broadband could alleviate some pressure from funding in other ministries. So as you'll see on the bottom right, we sort of created this map of all of the things that connectivity can do to improve it. So be it leisure and entertainment, you've got public safety that, instead of asking for community safety funding. It could alleviate it through Ministry of Infrastructure funding. Working from home and government services and elections could be on there and take pressure off from funding for those types of activities that otherwise would be sort of funded in silos. And so what we're suggesting in the paper is that councils really understand the unique opportunities that connectivity brings and discuss them in a broader conversation about whether or not to play a role in funding connectivity. Another important piece, we won't spend long on it, but it is important for context. We put this in appendix because it is quite lengthy, and I will happily defer to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities who have telecommunications in their bailiwick. And so what we've tried to do in this paper is just sort of differentiate the differences in roles. And we'll speak about that when we talk about championing the need for connectivity in the roadmap portion of this presentation. But certainly the regulatory oversight powers do lie with the federal government through 3 acts primarily. Of course, there's others, but telecommunications, broadcasting, and radio communications. The province does not regulate the telecoms industry directly. However, there are many things that it's interested in because of economic development purposes, COVID recovery, and the building of economic prosperity for all Ontarians. And so the boxes below just sort of summarize the different departments. We can get into it in questions, but won't at this point. But I think the key differentiator here is that ISED and CRTC are the 2 that sort of function at the federal level, and the province really deals with ministries such as energy, also OMAFRA, so Food and Rural Affairs, regulates the OEB, which regulates hydropole attachment rates, and of course the Ministry of Infrastructure. Before you're like, holy crow, this is a lot of words, I'm not reading them out loud to you. Don't worry, they are in the paper. But all to say that as you go through, we have recommended a series of actions that municipal governments believe that advocacy is required to change. And I think this gets to Craig's earlier point about the fact that we don't have a mandated role in telecommunications. As you can see, a lot of things are about providing a fair and consistent environment, leveraging the investments that they have made and making sure that technologies evolve. From the provincial level, it's talking about advocating to the federal government to expedite the rollout of funding, which of course we've seen and can talk to a bit later, but leveraging the nearly $1 billion in provincial broadband investment, which we think is fantastic. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but also additional supports, modernizing the OEB, and then reviewing provincial assets such as towers, buildings, land, utility poles to optimize this connectivity are all options and choices that we think people ought to advocate for, in addition to building a community business case for connectivity. Finally, there is a role for utilities and the private companies to play. Talking about the development and sustaining of relationships with municipal governments is really important. Talking about what barriers really do exist, and pushing back if there are things that, for instance, utility companies hear that they don't feel is either not misconstrued, but maybe not misunderstood, I would say, and vice versa. So talking about developing and sustaining relationships throughout what we're going to talk about next, which is sort of the mapping, identifying assets, et cetera. These are all important things to do. And so that's the part that we say in that primer of the paper. And then finally, Appendix C. One of the things that we had heard from our members when we were developing this was the fact that learning from other people that have already done things or are grappling with similar questions is something that the sector hasn't done enough of. And I mean, we could talk about what we're thinking about in 2021, which is about sharing these resources sort of more consistently through this a webinar format such as this. If you think this works well, this is the first one that we've done, but you'll see an outline of just the different ones that exist throughout the province. And so we really do encourage you to take a look and to see what your neighbors are doing. I will, of course, let Craig explain BARN a little bit later, but Broadband for Rural North, which is an international example, which is quite cool. And so, but we've added that as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop and invite Craig to come back on. And I'm not sure, because I can see the slides. I saw a couple things through the chat. So give me just a second and we'll see if we can either group these questions together. Craig, I'm not sure if you want to, if you've seen some of the questions come in to get us started.
At this
If
point,
not, I will just throw them to us. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so okay. So for the people that are looking for the chat function, by the way, I will say that it is in, for some of you, it will be under more with the 3 dots. And for those of you that don't, for those of you that don't see the Q&A, it's just in the, to the left of the share button for you, or it should be right beside the participants. So Craig, I will, as we're waiting for some questions, if not, I'm happy to go right into the roadmap. But did you want to jump in about some of the your experience with some of the models, and I'll give you the opportunity to speak to the barn one.
to the barn one. Amber always gives me the opportunity to speak to the barn one because I always speak to the barn one, it turns out. Barn is one of my favorite examples for Roma. And I don't even remember how I came across it now, but basically it is broadband for rural North. It's in Lancashire in England. And it's basically an example of a community that had tried for many, many years, decades, to get better internet and broadband services. Mostly, one of the people behind it was really trying to check in on her father in a long-term care home. And they didn't have any success with funding, but one day, this person who was also a hairdresser was cutting apparently the mailman's hair, so the story goes, and the mailman said, you know, what are you all so worked up about? You're all farmers, you've got backhoes, why don't you dig your own trenches and lay your own wire? So they started up a cooperative, and that's exactly what they did. It's very close to what happened in other parts of, I think it's Saskatchewan and Alberta, some examples. But apparently they've managed to take this rural community, very low population density relative to the rest of England, and turn it into to something that it has some of the best internet available. We do have a question that's come in the meantime.
There you go, though, Craig.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about barn. But Chris is asking, how far do you think the funding will go? And in other words, at the end of the process, will there still be those without? So I think that's hard to say, Chris. I think that will be dependent on how much can be leveraged from the private sector. And I think in addition to that, how far technology moves. So part of what we've tried to say in these documents is that this funding needs to lay the basis for a sustainable investment environment longer term. You know, I think there's not an inconsiderable amount of money on the table, nearly $1 billion from the province of Ontario, 1.75 billion from the federal government, plus other funds that the federal government has made available. Quite a substantial amount, but that's the UBF program, the Universal Broadband Fund program that we're talking about. There's other funding from the federal government through the investment bank and through the CRTC and others. You know, we'll have to see, and I think it'll be an interesting question. But I think what we can all say is that there's no way that these gaps can continue to exist any longer to the extent that they have. And I think we will be looking at a perpetual improvement.
Thanks, Craig. Just want to make sure.
We have a comment here. I appreciate the funding. 9 years, however, is 9 years away to 100. Understood. I think it is definitely a fair point to be made that that we're behind the 8 ball on this, and there, we are seeing years of policy decisions and market decisions, and the weight of those decisions coming to light. But I think it's fair to say we stand a better chance of closing that gap now, or narrowing that gap, for those rural residents and northern residents than we ever have, and new technologies should help in the near to, well, medium to near term.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think just to sort of build on those points, I think the elected officials at all levels are hearing similar things, which I think is all helpful pressure towards building momentum about, this is certainly something that, as I say, it's a large catalyst, but certainly not the only one. And so in this research, it's certainly not something that is also just noticed by Ontario. Part of the research Craig and I have been doing is working with other provinces and territories as well to make sure that that sort of the projects, and we'll speak to in the next section, are really shovel worthy as well as shovel ready as when those funding come in. So Craig, did you want to?
No, I just, we got another question coming in, which is about technologies, and I think we kind of opened the door for it. So let's see if we can answer it, or at least start to answer it right now. Okay. Discussing the impact of Telesat and US Starlink on connectivity programs. So if by connectivity programs you mean the funding, at this point, there is some federal funding available for low Earth orbit satellites, as was announced in the budget, I think, 2 years ago. And there's some more available for Telesat in this budget now, or this update rather. And I think it's fair to say that those two technology solutions will not have a huge impact on either the Universal Broadband Fund availability nor the Ontario ICON funding availability. That said, as we get closer to seeing those options move toward market viability or move toward market, really, I think it's fair to say that those could be really, really important for folks who live in more remote areas of the province and the nation, and where it would always be uneconomical to run cable or the ability to do wireless internet. That said, it's not as if it's one technology versus the other technology. They all work together. And you may see that it is possible to have those low Earth orbiting satellites become more of a community wireless internet solution in the longer term. Amber, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think just to say that they are, those companies operate quite differently. So Starlink, as we understand, is going to be a direct-to-consumer offering, whereas Telesat is not. It works through ISPs. And so I think just to sort of differentiate, and we can speak about that in some of the later sections, and we'll get into that next. But just to say that there are a lot of options that that certainly speaks to the sort of shorter term sort of stopgap measures and the long-term advocacy that's both needed, and both are really important to do almost in tandem. So what I'll do is, if it's okay, what I'd like to do is sort of go through, because I think these questions about funding, I just want to make sure that we get to, and I think they wrap really well with the roadmap. So the questions that did come in, we'll start with those in the next section, certainly, but I just want to make sure that as we're sort of going through, I want to get a sort of picture around what municipal governments can do if they so choose to get involved in connectivity. And I think this gets to some of the issues about funding and when to apply, et cetera. So the purpose of this really was to sort of show folks that the roadmap A is a nonlinear process. And so in the research that Craig and I did for ROMA and in our conversations with folks, what we had put forward initially was sort of a step-by-step sort of linear map, and that's not at all the case. And so what I like about the graphic at the bottom is the fact that the components are all sort of intertwined in a sense. There are some stages that will need to be repeated, take greater time, for instance, and there's some that that really do have to happen at the same time, and we'll go through them. So the way that we've sort of presented this to you is to show you sort of each of the components that we've put forward, explain with some of the examples, and then next steps for councils to consider. And so what we wanted to do here was not to sort of give you all the solutions in this presentation, but rather to speak to some of the options that exist. And then as we go into the question section, answer them there. So the first component that we thought was really important was for councils to identify the state of connectivity in their municipalities and to figure out what assets really exist within your own boundaries. And I think, let's start with within your own boundaries. I think a lot of folks, as we were going through these and presenting some of the main ideas, there are some that are saying, I don't know where to start. And I think the good news is that you can start as within your boundaries, within your own staff. And so the first thing that we're suggesting is to learn the basics, not to suggest to become sort of IT experts, but certainly understanding the terminology and terms is really going to help you when you get approached by some of these telecommunications service providers and internet service providers who are looking for information. We thought this was particularly timely because, of course, those two funds are now open, and we'll speak to that. However, making sure that you know what it is that they're looking for is really important. One of the other things that we had seen as a best practice was establishing a cross-departmental working group on connectivity. And that was from a lot of IT folks that were saying, I'm working from connectivity from this part, but I had no idea that my public works and my roads folks were working on it from that side. And I don't know where or when those roads are getting built up. And so I can't necessarily work across. And there's other ones that have strategy advisors within mayor's offices. So how those all work together, we're suggesting, maybe establishing a working group within your municipality to talk it through. It doesn't need to be extensive, but just people that that touch connectivity in different ways, and getting them talking to each other and figuring out what each other is doing. The other thing we talked about is the use of mapping tools, and we'll speak to that in both the availability map and the eligibility mapping tool that exists right now under the Universal Broadband Fund, but to understand what service levels are either advertised and experienced on the ground. One of the things that we hear from our rural members quite often is, yeah, you could tell me that I'm supposed to be up to 50/10, but on a good day I'm like 10 and 1. So 10 megabits per second download, 1 megabit per second upload. And so what's really important is to look at what connectivity the federal government and the provincial government think that you have, and then maybe, map out what you actually think is experienced. The other thing is to identify early on what stands in your way of better connectivity. And that could be anything. That could be things like utility poles that exist, that talks about land, it talks about rights of way, all of those things. And so that's really the biggest piece of it that seems overwhelming. And so we'll talk about a bit about how we can make that less overwhelming, but it is really a data collection exercise for one with the right people around the table. The second component that we talked about was, okay, based on what you are doing, and at the same time, you really need to understand what the true drivers are and assess the needs against those, and then find solutions for those. So what we've talked about is this needs assessment, which is just sort of a policy term everyone hears, but really, what is it that's driving the need for it? What are you hearing from your students, your families, your businesses, your seniors? Is it that they're going to McDonald's to upload work? Is it that certain long-term care homes don't have access at all to any fiber, or certain low-income neighborhoods have been completely missed? For instance, these are all anecdotal information that we've heard. And so we said, determine what areas within your municipal boundaries are the greatest need for connectivity, and then match those solutions. So we are not to say, and this is really important to sort of, and should have said it at the outset, my apologies, but ROMA and AMO are absolutely agnostic to any technology, company, or association that wants to bring connectivity to your community. And so when we ask questions about, one company versus another versus a different type of technology, the point that we are trying to do as policy staff for you folks is to say, here's all of the possible solutions. It's up to you in your own local decision making to figure out the circumstances and needs. So, Craig, did you?
Yeah, sorry, Amber. I just wanted to add to that very,
Yeah,
very
go
quickly.
ahead. Yeah, jump in whenever.
We are focusing on rural and northern and remote communities in these two documents. But we also hear quite regularly, as Amber's comments sort of lead you to understand, that there are areas within urban regions or ex-urban, ex-rural areas, type of in between, that really do have these problems with connectivity as well, almost on the same level. So we've tried to come up with a way, a bit of a framework for everyone to understand how to deal with that through process and policy, rather than sort of focusing only on rural. So I just wanted to
A
add
great
that.
point.
Thank you.
No, that's a great point. And I think the other anecdote to that point is I can see the CN Tower, but I can't get connected. So it's absolutely something that that is felt in urban areas as well throughout the province. And that's just broadband. That's not cellular. So we could talk about the north as well. In terms of component 3, this is something that we put third. Of course, all of these are sort of to be discussed as a sort of overall strategy, but recognizing that you do not have to play a role if your municipality does not want to. It is not a mandated role. So this is not something that sort of come out of the blue that is to suggest that, as you see in the spectrum of options on the top right, you do not have to own your own broadband network. And in fact, Craig and I are the first ones to say that's likely not a sustainable option for many of you. And yet, on the other side of things, letting the market operate on its own is what's happening now. And so that is absolutely an option that you can continue. The status quo should be one of the things that you evaluate, but there's also possible municipal roles in between those. And so what we've suggested in this component is to talk as a council and be honest about the level of digital capacity and resources that are available. So as you're evaluating these different options, learning from other municipalities, which is something we spoke to a bit earlier about who's grappling with this question, what did they start talking about, and what expertise is there to learn from? Because what you are going through in your own councils, in your own areas and regions, is not different from any other ones, because not only the COVID pandemic has sort of put everyone into this sort of overnight work from home scenario, as you'll see here, but it is an order of magnitude, really, but a lot of the issues are the same. And also, once the rule has been established at any point, and that's one of a longer term sort of strategy, but you have to really recognize the importance of sustaining that role. So this is not a point in time exercise where we say, here's what we're going for. You really have to sustain it, particularly if you're going on to sort of the right hand of that spectrum. In between those, we said component 4 is to figure out what potential tools you already have to manage connectivity needs. This could be its own webinar in itself, but in essence, what we're saying is there's lots of tools that already exist in the purview of your own municipal governments. You could create things like bylaws and permits. To protect municipal assets is really important. We are not to suggest that putting forward things that inhibit or prohibit telecommunications companies from coming in. I know that there's another sort of issue where they're not coming in, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for those that are having people sort of come to you and companies come to you asking for support in any of these applications, for instance, it's important to know that there are tools to use. And so you should be asking staff about how to protect those assets, because there is accountability and transparency around taxpayer dollars. The other things we suggest is that a staff person that's responsible for procedures and processes across departments, and this could be part of the working group sort of exercise number 1, is to figure out where to simplify where possible and where it's still accountable, but simplify processes. So one of the things anecdotally we had heard from one of the companies that provide internet services is they were saying what's really helpful is to have sort of a conduit or a one window person in a municipality, so that I can go to one person as opposed to different departments. And so it's things like that. How do we sort of think about not necessarily making it, losing track of certain steps, but trying to simplify the process so that it can go a little bit smoother project-wise. And then finally, this is something that that folks across all industry and governments have said, is that the laying of conduit and fiber where possible at the time of construction is going to be the cheapest. So when you're ripping up roads, you should be talking to your folks that are dealing with connectivity to figure out how you can sort of dig once, as the policy is sort of states. And there are some examples of those that have put those in already. The biggest thing I will say is component number 5, and this is of course sort of step 0, but also 1, 2, 3, 4 is championing the need for connectivity. So as a council, we really do need to make sure that the data that you're identifying in your connectivity is connected to a narrative, because I think as you folks all know, when you're talking to residents, being able to tell the province and the federal government about the lost opportunities to your communities without broadband is going to be really important. And so identifying local champions, be it students, families, businesses, seniors, to tell your story will be important. We also suggest leveraging the advocacy power of ourselves and other organizations locally. As I would say, FCM as well has done a lot of work on rights of way and telecommunications space on sort of who does what and what responsibilities are where. But also when you're meeting with federal members of parliament, it's important to differentiate, as we say in Appendix B in the primer, is talking about what can you do to advocate to CRTC and ISED, which is separate from MPPs, about the community needs and resources. And I say one of the biggest differentiators is this idea of an essential service and the need to advocate for it to be talked about as sort of the new electricity or things, as some folks say. That is really a federal decision that's going to have to be made. And so if that's what your council decides to do and advocate for, then that's something that's federally related. And then MPPs, obviously for funding through the ICON program, but also sort of those sector benefits, those soft things about e-government, e-learning, things like that. And so with that, I'll pass it to Craig to add his 2 cents on this.
Actually, just 1 cent. It's just quickly, we had a question come in on the chat that I was going to take sequentially, but I figured you were talking about something that related to it, so I would deal with it. So it comes from Denny Dorval. He says, I'm an elected official from Northern Ontario. Who should take the lead and make sure our region is not forgotten? Is it the role of the Regional Technology Development Organization? And I think as Amber has been talking, you know, it really is up to council to decide what role you want to play. If the technology development organization is working for you, then absolutely. But there are various opportunities in various organizations. But I will say that we are seeing probably the most success, or hearing that the most success comes from, or comes to communities where council is engaged, where residents are engaged, and this is something that is a priority. And it doesn't mean that council has to take the responsibility for funding this. There are various organizations, but as Amber noted, you know, it does come down to the advocacy priority of council. There may be some policy priorities that you put down, or some funding of your own, depending on what role you want to play. Or, you know, you can make it easier for companies to do business, as Amber was saying. But council needs to make that decision to really understand how best to shift into improved connectivity for your local organization.
Thank you. And thanks for that, because I can't see the questions come in. So appreciate that and jump in whenever. But I think the other thing to make sure that we recognize, similar with this whole sustainability issue about how do you sustain the momentum, it is about building digital capacity. And there's a chart that I'll show you on the next slide, but is really more pertinent to component 5, is the digital capacity of a community is really, really important. And to make sure that whatever systems you're advocating for enhance digital inclusion and are viable for the end users that use it. So part of that, as I'll go to sort of component number 6, is talking about investing strategically in shovel-worthy projects as opposed to shovel-ready, although if you do have those, that's certainly something to continue investing in. But I'm talking about the ones, the communities that are really interested in sort of how to begin. And what I'll say, and I think this gets to some of the funding questions that I've seen, is especially to Chris's point, is that when this funding is over, what's next, right? And I think the important thing to say is that there are really interesting different models of other people that are coming to the table to fund it, whether it be sort of private equity firms, for instance, in these micro projects that are smaller than these sort of large impact projects that the federal government is advocating for, the rapid response stream of those sort of smaller projects that are supposed to be sort of done by the end of November, as we'll speak about. But as you think about it and you look at this digital readiness roadmap that's provided by a researcher out of Brandon, Manitoba, you sort of see this framework of you have to be ready digitally. So you have to really invest in your people. And you have to make sure that if there are things like coding, geographic information systems, or where to get GIS sort of help, but also knowing, and it's not necessarily recreating the wheel. It's investing in people that can then figure out where it is that you're going to pull some of those resources from. So, and there are plenty of people throughout the province that do just this. And so it's important that not only on the people side, but the projects are being invested in. And wherever possible, this is this future-proofing technology, and it's something that we continue to grapple with. But obviously, projects that are more scalable and future-proofed using those technologies wherever possible is important, because if you were to, for instance, not lay fiber, that's the only real sort of, through our research at least, the only real future-proof technology, whereas satellites are things that are obviously continuing to evolve. And so what's really necessary is whatever you're going to invest in, you really do have to sort of evaluate what does this look like in 10 years, to the point of sort of continuing to sort of evolve this technology, because it cannot just be a project that's sort of done and then left on its own, because technology will continue to evolve, as we've seen. Finally, this issue about performance measurement targets is something that federally is something that we think is important to advocate for, in the sense that similarly, when we use public tax dollars and municipal projects, the same should really ought to apply to these telecommunications companies. And I think one of the things about letting the market operate on its own, which is something that's been happening for the last few decades, is that telecommunications companies are providing service to a certain standard that, on the other end, the end users are saying they're not experiencing on the ground. And so how do you tie those companies to make sure that the targets that they're being funded to do are actually achieved? Finally, partnering. Partnering said 6 times on the slide, and we cannot understate it enough. We talk a lot about gathering information within your own community to start, but it absolutely does need to include neighboring municipalities to leverage economies of scale at the right time. And also local institutions and public sector organizations within your boundaries as well is something that you can sort of leverage and make it a bit more palatable of a business case potentially for these private telco companies. Finally, the need to build relationships with the telecommunications service providers and the internet service providers in your community is really important as you are identifying the existing assets. So if there are things that you are saying, for instance, you're looking at the federal map and you see things that you're like, oh, I don't know if that's actually experienced on the ground, reaching out to your companies that are in your communities will be really important. And that way, as you're building those relationships, when the data is collected and money flows, it's a lot easier to identify sort of who exists in your area currently, recognizing, of course, that many municipal elected officials on this call will know that they are economic development. They're businesses that exist in your community, and they staff a lot of your residents. So it's important to figure out what incumbents or pre-existing companies exist, as well as ones that want to come to your community. To give people sort of a quick tip guide, these are things that if you are just sort of saying to Craig and I'm out of here, this is too much. We don't have staff for this. What we're saying is, those with limited resources, here's some three tips to sort of get started, or staff to bring forward to councils to say, these are things that are obviously longer term, but building leadership is important. Increasing your own institutional awareness by using staff expertise and investing in people, and then understanding what it's going to take to make yourselves infrastructure ready are sort of three starting points that we're suggesting to get started with. So, key takeaways. I'll start, and then I'll defer to Craig to highlight some of these points. So it's not intended to overwhelm. This material is intended to help. And if your council hasn't started on these things, it's okay, because it is just the start of the conversation. It is not a mandated role that you ought to play. The mapping, and I think I saw a quick question about it, and we'll get into it, but mapping a community's connectivity is something that the Canadian Internet Registration Authority has already done a lot of work with. So the acronym is CIRA, and what they do is they're in charge of all the .ca domain names, but the other things that they do is they give back to sort of the broader internet community. And so one of the things that they've done is create a mapping system or an internet performance test whereby your residents can voluntarily provide data into that, either in partnership with you or separately. And that sort of feeds in to the mapping that's available at the federal level as well. So that's something to be aware of, that you do not need to go procure your own mapping specialists. There are a range of models and options to choose from to fit a community's priorities and circumstances. So obviously, we always say one size doesn't fit all, and it really doesn't. And circumstances might change between the range of models that you need from one community or one neighborhood from another. So don't think that one solution is going to fit all within your own community. It's not a point in time exercise, but a longer term effort. And so the champions in your community are going to be very important. And finally, that ROMA is here and happy to help. And we'll leave you with some links at the end about sort of the websites that we've got. But Craig, do you want to sort of highlight any of these and add your 2 cents?
Well, I want to maybe pick up on CIRA and sort of points 2 and 3 in particular. So, and the reason why is there are a couple of questions that came in that I do want to start to deal with. So basically, I think some folks were asking about where to start with internet speed tests in your communities, just to make sure communities are getting what they want. So as Amber said, it's best to start with those that are providing services to your community, the TSPs and ISPs. Most services will have a speed test that residents and customers basically are able to test against their plans to make sure that they're getting the download speeds that are advertised and the upload speeds for that matter. But I also believe CIRA has an internet or a test on their website that you can access. And there are lots of other options that you can Google as well. And the important thing is to do a few of them and make sure that that you're triangulating to an average sort of speed. So I think that was a question that came in. The other question that came in was about who should be advocating for Northern Ontario and who should be applying for funding, such as the UBF. It was a question about the federal minister saying the fund is open to municipalities, but Blue Skynet was handling that as well. So the UBF is open to municipalities as well as other entities to make applications for improved connectivity. And it really does depend on what role the municipality wants to play. If you're content with the idea of Blue Skynet or your economic development folks taking that lead, then that's fine. If on the other hand the municipality wants to take a greater lead in applications, then you're encouraged to do so. It depends on what you want to see as an outcome for your residents. I do know that both of those applications, or both of those programs rather, require a council resolution to say that council is aware of the project and supports it. So that's one thing to be aware of as those applications come in. There was another question that came in, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to look for it. Amber, I don't know if you want to add anything while I do.
No, I think you answered that one quite effectively. I think it's just there is, it really just speaks to the fact of getting out and speaking, getting your staff to speak to the people that already exist. That those incumbent, it does not just mean incumbent companies, but other ones, including ECDEV, as Craig alluded to, are really important.
So if it's okay with you, I know we wanted to get to some of the other funding questions, but I think we've got a number of questions that have come in, so maybe we should take them one at a time.
Yes.
So the first question that comes in is from Gilles Laderoute. Gilles says, what are the timelines or dates for getting Northeastern Ontario communities up to speed with this broadband incentive on the infrastructure and funding that? So great question, Gilles. I think it's fair to say that the timelines that have been put out are by the federal government, which is that all Canadians should have access to 50 megabit upload, 10 download speeds by 2030.
Opposite.
Sorry.
Opposite.
What did I do?
50 download, 10 upload.
And upload. Yeah, sorry. So that's completely correct. And by 2030, and they have an interim target in there, which the UBF is intended to move the yardsticks towards. So 10 years is a long time. I think they said they wanted up to 90%. I can't exactly remember in the recent
95 by 2026, I believe.
By 2026. There you go. So that is the timeline that's out there that everyone is working towards. But that said, that is not the ceiling, it is the floor. So it is entirely possible that there will be areas of Northeastern Ontario, perhaps even all of Northeastern Ontario, connected before that time, hopefully. Are you aware of any collaborative online mapping tools? I think we dealt with that one in terms of where you could do mapping. There are lots of tools out there, and we encourage you to use all of them, or many of them, so that you get at least an idea of the speeds that are being reported. But the best place to start is with the service providers in your area. On identify the state of connectivity, this is from Yarda. Do you have a suggestion for a common language so all municipalities can report it to the ROMA connectivity group? So we have, in terms of the common language, it is difficult because, as I said at the outset, this is such a technical area, so engineering heavy. We have really tried to provide common definitions in this, and we're hoping that as we move along and councils and municipalities and communities become more comfortable with connectivity, that this language will become more commonplace. In terms of connectivity, I think it really comes down to where you are on the mapping that has been developed by the ISED department and the federal government and the CRTC against the speeds that you should be having. But once you're there, then I think, basically I've been referring to these documents as a foundational briefing for municipal governments. And so the idea is that this is to provide a common language and framework that we can all understand connectivity through. Is there a model where an ISP will be willing to provide CRTC connectivity? I can't see this as the ISPs are profit driven. This is from Barbara Bridgman. So I'm not sure where to start with this one, but I think it's fair to say that ISPs are definitely driven by profits, but they're also driven by policy and incentives that are there. And the UBF and ICON programs are there to try and reduce the barriers to entry that they've seen. The other things that you can do are things that we've suggested, such as set up a committee, start to think of those dig once policies, think about how you can facilitate ISPs in the community. But basically the CRTC target is a regulatory target. And it's something that the government of Canada is driving all of the country towards. So it is fair to say that all Canadians at some point, if that policy is to be a success, will have 5010 access. Just a reminder from Helen that Sierra Data is at a cost, but where they get it from is free, and there's access to it here. Measurement Lab, thank you very much, Helen. We will be sure to put that on. Helen has been a strong contributor to this project, and we appreciate having access to her and her knowledge all the time. So thank you, Helen. We will put that up for sure.
Yeah, we'll add that into the slide deck before we send it out. So thank you.
Details on timelines. Okay, that's Gilles responding. And then Denzel Ferguson says, too rural for McDonald's, unfriendly terrain. Has the use of hydropoles progressed to those very delinquent areas? I think it's fair to say that hydropoles, we have learned, are a much more complex area than we thought when we first took on this project. It is wrapped up in user rates for electricity customers, in shareholders for Hydro One, of which the province of Ontario is a shareholder, and that value, as well as regulations for electrical safety and the mandated height of those poles. So I think it's fair to say that both the government of Ontario, Hydro One, and even the OEB are very, very well aware of this, and we have been pushing them to try to come up with some solutions. We're optimistic that they are working on those. But there are, as I understand it, hundreds of thousands of hydropoles across Ontario, as a low estimate, and those poles all cost a lot of money to put up, and new poles are needed of a certain height to have those attachment rates from an electrical safety point of view. So we think there's a fair bit of work going on. We're optimistic that that we will get to a point where it will be solved, but unfortunately, Denzel, I can't promise you today or tomorrow that will be the case.
Craig, I just want to, you'll see the same Q&A here. I want to defer that one because I think it's a great point, and I want to just bring up to other folks the details about UBF and ICON as well. But there's one other question in the chat that I'd love for you to take. It says, will a formula be developed to which areas will receive priority consideration? If so, what might the factors be?
And that's from Darlene Plumley, and I apologize, Darlene. I saw that and meant to start answering that earlier. So I think it is fair to say that the priority areas right now are those as defined by the federal government and in some cases the provincial government as having inadequate access to connectivity. And it comes back to that mapping process. So if you are unconnected right now, if you're in a remote region and unconnected, or you have satellite connection but it is spotty at best, or extremely unaffordable, or if you find that your residents are having to take on several plans to manage their affordability, then that is the criteria for priority. The same thing goes for the mapping, which is why we've paid so much attention to mapping and the internet speeds. So back to the point about CIRA or the link
M Labs.
thank you.
Yep.
That Helen put up, M Labs. We want to make sure that that folks are aware of them and doing those sorts of speeds tests to understand where they are on that spectrum of connectivity. Until, and again, it is an option for municipalities to become involved. The reality is municipalities have become involved in connectivity because they haven't seen adequate connectivity in their communities, and they're advocating on behalf of residents and businesses. But to the degree to which you get involved is up to you. And it is based on the level of need in the community, and need is defined by affordability, speed, and mapping. So as well as some other factors. So those gap factors that Amber was talking about. And I think maybe there's an entree to something I wanted to raise earlier. We've heard about Blue Skynet. We know about EORN and SWIFT in certain parts of in the eastern and western parts of the province, respectively. These are organizations that have been formed from municipal governments and with a mandate from municipal governments to improve connectivity in their areas. And they help to do that sort of work for their members. And if you live in an area where they are active or in part of their jurisdiction, we encourage you to reach out to them because they are resources. We're not necessarily advocating for a particular model at AMO or ROMA, because our members have all sorts of models, from 100% market to, in certain cases, owning their own ISPs. And one of our members lays fiber and rents it out to the private sector to operate. And then there are regional models like EORN and SWIFT and Blue Skynet that try to help communities with that sort of access. But there probably is a good business case. Back to Amber's point about partner. There is a good business case for municipalities in certain regions coming together and trying to map out what they want to see, and making sure that they are coordinated with their neighbors to one extent or another. So I'd encourage you to explore those models that we've put forward there. There's always Barn, which I mentioned earlier, but there are others out there, and some of them are homegrown. So please explore.
Thanks, Craig. That's helpful, and well done getting through all of those. So I wanted to give you a sense of some of the funding programs that exist. These are meant to be not exhaustive, but I just wanted to tell you that based on what you're going to see in the next few slides, they are both the provincial and federal programs, but the specifics really, we're going to make sure that you have all the links here, and we really do suggest that you reach out directly. So on the federal level, this Universal Broadband Fund is something that was launched back in November, so a day ago, as a key component of the strategy. They also have a roadmap for rural Canada. So this is something that was announced back in a previous budget and was just launched last month. There is a bit more money than was originally committed to, and so they've committed $1.75 billion over the next 6 years. And what you'll see is sort of three different things that we want to make sure that you're aware of. There are different thresholds. So what you'll see is obviously the three sort of sub bullets do not add up to 1.75. That is completely on purpose. They've done three different streams. So one is large impact projects. They have up to $750 million. These are things that they have not defined as to what large is, but they are looking for the largest impact, whether it be entire swaths of highways, entire sort of huge regions that are not connected up to 5010 currently. There's also up to 50 million available for mobile projects that primarily benefit Indigenous peoples. And then what we really wanted to let you know about is this 150 million that's available as part of this rapid response stream. And we'll talk about that in a second. For those that mentioned Telesat earlier, they did get a 600 million agreement with the federal government to secure advanced low Earth orbit or LEO capacity. And so we'll, if there's time permitting, we'll sort of speak to that as well. But that's a separate and apart from commitment that the government made about the 1.75. Very important, this rapid response stream. The applications are due January 15th of next year. This is Canada-wide. This is the federal program. The application is linked there. I will say in the FAQs, the government makes it very clear that the sooner the better to get your application in. There is 150 million available for the entire country. Part of the application is quite short. It's about 5 pages last I checked, and work has to be completed by November 15th. So this is designed for households that are really super close to getting connected, but just are missing a bit of funding. And so that's one pot of money that's available. The rest of the programs, so anything else that does not have to do with the rapid response stream, it seems that they are due February 15th of 2021, which gives you a whole extra month. And the projects can be completed anytime between then and March 31st, 2027. So longer term, what I would say based on sort of the time we have today here, look at their website. They have a series of webinars. They've done about 4 or 5 already. They're quite good. There's also a lot of frequently asked questions. And the federal government has also provided different advisors for provinces. And so the 1-800 number and the email will get delivered to ISED staff that are putting the funding together, and they can answer your specific questions on UBF. The other thing that that I sort of put in is the availability maps. So these are the maps that they're using to determine whether or not these projects are eligible. Very important, check them out. And you can get them, I say no more hexagons with an exclamation mark, because it's something that we had certainly advocated for the removal of this 25 square kilometer hexagon model that they were using, which used to suggest that if one house in that hexagon was provided with service, that economically it would mean that the rest of them would eventually get connected. That has gone. So what they've done now is they've replaced the mapping to 250 meter road segments, which are much, you can zero in much more, which we think is great and should be applauded for that. There's also the eligibility mapping tool, and they've provided a video of sort of how you can use it. And so when we send out the slide deck, we really do encourage you to check out some of these links. The ICON program is improving connectivity in Ontario program, so obviously provincial. It is something that the province has been working very hard on since July 2019 with their announcement of the Broadband Cellular Action Plan. It's called Up to Speed. It's linked there. Since then, they've announced nearly $1 billion, which we think is fantastic. If you see the UBF by contrast at 1.75 billion, we think this is an incredible investment, and we think this is really going to, as you'll see, the ICON program doubled in size. So it went from 150 million, which is the exact same amount of rapid response stream, but it is federal. So it takes a little while to sort of differentiate those things, but now the ICON program does have 300 million attached to it. And then last month as well, they committed an additional 680. So the extra 150 to double the ICON program was announced in November. The other 530 million, we don't have details on or how they're allocating that money yet, but intake rather for ICON remains open. And so the application guide is there for you as well. There is, as Craig and I were quick to jump on this, you can stack the funding. And so the federal government and ICON representatives are best to sort of explain the specifics about how those work. But recognizing we're at sort of 121 and want to make some time for the last questions. I'll leave this up and just to let you know, the webpage does exist on ROMA's webpage. It has the primer and the roadmap that we've spoken about today. ROMA does have a Facebook page, so you're welcome to join on that. And then the thing that's really interesting is the fact that connectivity is going to be a focal point of programming at the ROMA conference, which is just, I think, 2 months away. So it's going to be the 25th and 26th of January, 2021. We have 2 interesting concurrent sessions that are going to happen. And that is the Getting Connected, practical steps that communities can take to close the divide. And then the second one is about how communities and industries can work better together. And I will say that Telesat, Cradle Point are 2 companies that will be there, as well as Hydro One is in one. And the other one is going to be CIRA, which is the Internet Registration Authority that we spoke about, is one option for mapping, and CENGEN, which is the Next Generation Center of Excellence. And they're currently providing some funding for micro projects. So this is the piece about the other type of funding that exists. So even outside of ICON and UBF, there seems to be some interest available to provide for shovel-worthy projects. So stay tuned for more on that. The other thing I'd say is we're creating a database of folks just to make sure that as other webinars, as Craig and I sort of talk about what 2021 looks like, if you want to be included on sort of more in-depth emails from Craig and I as staff, happy to do that. Just send that link a note. It goes right to my email. So I will work with Brittany from ROMA, who's fantastic, and make sure that everyone gets the information. But with that, we just wanted to thank you. And I will, I'm not sure, Craig, if you've seen, if there are other questions that we want to.
So we have 2 questions that I think we should address quite directly. The last one's from Bev Holmes, who asks who should be completing the rapid response stream application, municipalities or providers. And I think the answer is it depends on who has a project that's ready to go. The rapid response stream, as the name would indicate, is about projects that are able to be put in place to be completed and get improved connectivity in the next year. If a municipality has a project that's ready to go, they are eligible to apply. Most likely it would be a municipality working with a provider. And in some cases it would, or in many cases it might be a private company. But the idea is it's quick wins to improve connectivity, and in areas where it's identified that those connections or that connectivity is lacking based on those criteria that we spoke about before. So I hope that answers that question, Bev. And then I just wanted to quickly address Suzanne Dion's question about, this is something I referred to earlier, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand what I was saying, Suzanne. So everyone's aware, Suzanne asks about a major ISP not providing service in the area currently, has made an announcement that it will be creating a project with private funding and a small amount of public funding to improve connectivity in those areas. And Suzanne is uncertain that it will solve the problem. And I think that's where councils and the resolutions that are part of these applications comes into play. I would suggest that you reach out to those programs and those the federal and provincial programs that Amber provided you the information for previously. I'd suggest you reach out to them and make sure that you've done your due diligence in terms of whether you think it will solve the problem or not. I think you probably need to do that. So That would be my advice to you. I know that there's probably there are probably other people in your situation, which is why I wanted to address that. But at the same time, the funding would be awarded based on a very thorough evaluation of what could be done and whether it would improve the outcomes. So I think that's it for our questions, and we are, by my clock, a whole 4 minutes in advance of when we promised to get you out.
Craig, can I just jump in with just a couple tips? This is something that we've heard from some folks. Just to let you know, for the ICON program, and also for UBF, municipal councils are being asked to provide letters of support. Some I've heard are being asked to sign exclusivity agreements to suggest that providing support for one would preclude you from another one. That is not something that is certainly necessary for those programs. So we wanted to let you know that. And also, there is no requirement for either fund to provide your own municipal funding towards those projects. So just to let you know, really important points. You should not be signing any exclusivity agreements. The idea about the municipal support is to help with government when they're evaluating your projects to make sure that you are on board with companies coming in. But you can sign as many as you want, quite frankly. So that's it. Yeah. So so with that, I wanted to thank Craig. It's hard to go through these questions and sort of answer them yourself, and it's tough sometimes to not hear other people's voices. So certainly, we want to thank you all for staying on and appreciate. This is the first attempt that we've done on broadband directly through webinar. So we'd be interested in your thoughts of whether it worked, what we could do better. You know, we've got our emails up here, and if there's things offline that you want to share with us or give us a shout, we're certainly available. And Craig, did you?
No, I wanted to say absolutely. If there's something that you hated, I suppose we're open to that as well. So please send us an email. But hopefully everyone's relatively satisfied. And back to where I started, I hope we have given you an idea of the municipal policy and governance lens, the options and levers in front of municipalities, and the process that you can follow when you're starting to think about connectivity, realizing that it is not indeed your mandated responsibility. So thank you to Amber for doing a lot of the heavy lifting on today, and also generally speaking. And I hope it's been really helpful to everyone today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I hope that you all have a great afternoon. Take care.